Most companies view the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, as a localized compliance checklist, a set of rules that only apply if you have a physical office somewhere between Lisbon and Warsaw. But look at how data actually moves. A server in California pushes an update to a mobile device in Berlin. A physical border cannot intersect that transaction. So the European Union designed a regulatory net that expands to meet the data wherever it travels. By doing so, the European Union engineered an aggressive assertion of extraterritorial jurisdiction. They built a legal framework that operates across sovereign lines, acting as a global regulatory regime. The baseline logic driving this expansion is straightforward. The EU defines the natural person operating in a digital environment as a vulnerable subject. Protecting that subject requires following their data, not their geography. To understand how this borderless enforcement actually works in practice, we have to deconstruct the regulation's three structural pillars: its jurisdictional triggers, its liability architecture, and the judicial engine that interprets it all. Under modern EU law, where you incorporate your business or park your servers no longer dictates who holds legal jurisdiction over your operations. The foundation of this system is Article 3, Paragraph 1 of the GDPR, known as the Establishment Criteria. This scenario maps it out. You have a parent company headquartered in the United States, but they maintain a subsidiary office in France that captures local data. Because there is a physical establishment tied to the data processing, the entire operation falls under EU jurisdiction, even if the actual computing happens in California. But the real shift in international law occurs in Article 3, Paragraph 2. This introduces the targeting and effects criteria. Let's shift to a company with zero physical footprint in Europe. They have no offices, no servers, and no employees there. However, their website uses a .de top-level domain and offers a toggle to pay in euros. Those digital indicators prove the company is actively offering services to or monitoring the behavior of EU residents. That intent automatically subjects the foreign entity to EU law, erasing the legal protection of geographic distance. This creates a logistical problem. If a foreign company has no physical assets or employees in Europe, how does a European supervisory authority actually enforce a penalty against them? The answer is Article 27. When a foreign entity targets EU data subjects, the GDPR mandates that they formally designate a legal representative located within the Union. This representative acts as a direct proxy. They are the entity that the national data protection authorities will address, investigate, and hold accountable when processing violations occur. Through Article 27, the EU artificially creates a physical anchor inside its borders. It forces a digital-only foreign operation to build a local point of liability, ensuring they cannot simply ignore overseas regulators. When a data breach does happen, the enforcement mechanism relies on severe financial stakes. We can diagram this liability by looking at the two primary actors in any data transaction. You have the controller, the entity that determines the purpose of collecting the data, and you have the processor, the third-party vendor that actually executes the processing. Now introduce the individual whose data was compromised, resulting in material or non-material damage. Under older frameworks, the controller might point the finger at the processor to dodge the penalty. Article 82 of the GDPR eliminates that loophole by establishing a cumulative liability regime. It grants the individual the right to seek full compensation from either the controller or the processor, or both. By structuring liability this way, the regulation ensures that corporations cannot escape legal responsibility by burying it in vendor contracts. Both parties share the risk. This private enforcement creates a complex conflict of laws. If a foreign entity breaches the GDPR and causes non-material damage, which specific national law governs the compensation rules?
When a contract exists, the EU's Rome I regulation clearly dictates the governing law. But non-contractual torts, situations where there is no direct agreement between the user and the company, fall into a dense legal gray area. A significant portion of the legal community assumes the Rome II regulation cannot resolve this. They point to Article 1, Paragraph 2G, which explicitly excludes non-contractual obligations arising from violations of privacy. We can deconstruct that assumption by mapping the legislative timeline. First came the Data Directive in 1995. then the Rome II regulation in 2007, and finally the GDPR in 2016. When lawmakers drafted Rome II in 2007, privacy and data protection had very distinct legal definitions. The privacy exception was specifically targeted at media defamation and press freedom. Technical data processing was already governed separately by the 1995 directive. Therefore, data protection was never fully absorbed into Rome II's privacy exception. The Rome II rules must apply to GDPR torts. This ensures courts can use a harmonized system for private enforcement, rather than fracturing decisions across 27 different national laws. The final mechanism of control dictates how data legally exits the EU and enters foreign jurisdictions. This flowchart maps Chapter 5 of the regulation. For data to leave the Union, it must pass through one of three decision gates: an adequacy decision, standard contractual clauses, or specific derogations. Gate 1, the adequacy decision, is the preferred route. It functions like a public international law treaty, where the European Commission formally recognizes that a foreign country's domestic laws offer an equivalent level of protection to the GDPR. But securing an adequacy decision is a fragile, politically charged process. The Court of Justice of the European Union has a history of invalidating these agreements, striking down both the safe harbor and privacy shield frameworks with the United States because U.S. surveillance practices failed to meet European standards. When diplomacy fails, companies must rely on Gate 2, standard contractual clauses. This bypasses the government level entirely. These clauses act as a private contractual workaround. If a host nation lacks adequate laws, the EU forces the foreign data importer to legally bind themselves to European privacy standards internally through their corporate contracts. How does a framework this massive operate across 27 distinct linguistic and legal systems without collapsing under the weight of translation? It relies on the ultimate authority in European law, the Court of Justice of the European Union. The court holds the framework together using an operational doctrine called autonomous interpretation. If the court relied on literal linguistic translations, the meaning of a legal term in German might differ slightly from its meaning in Italian. To prevent that fragmentation, the court intentionally marginalizes direct dictionary definitions. Instead, they use a method called hybridization. They rely on teleological, or purpose-driven, arguments, examining a law based on its systematic goals rather than its syntax. This doctrine empowers the court to define complex concepts based purely on the spirit of the treaty, the fundamental right to data protection. It ensures that the law is applied uniformly across the globe, immune to the quirks of national translation. We see the results of this interpretive engine in practice every day. Autonomous interpretation actively decouples essential terms like personal data, processing, and controller from the constraints of local national laws. It gives them independent, EU-wide definitions that bind any company interacting with the European market. The GDPR is a masterclass in modern legal engineering. By combining aggressive extraterritorial reach, strict cumulative liability, and autonomous judicial interpretation, the European Union built a mechanism that successfully forces the globe to comply with its standards.